Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the Sports Law and Policy Center Dialogues. Sports Law and Policy Center Dialogues is a series of panel discussion with eminent changemakers in the sports industry, where they deliberate key legal and policy issues affecting Indian sport. Today's topic for discussion is athlete activism in sport. And I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We have Mr. Mihir Vasavda, Assistant Editor at the Indian Express. We have Saurabh Bhattacharjee, Assistant Professor at the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences. And our moderator for the session is Mr. Abhijeet Kulkarni, our sports consultant and journalist. Before we begin the session, I would like to request all our viewers to please keep their cameras and mics switched off for the entire duration of the session. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Zoom chat box, and our speakers will address it at the end of the session. So I'd like to now hand it over to Mr. Abhijeet Kulkarni to take forward the discussion.
Thanks, Yogita. I think a very interesting subject today. Like the year 2020 was a shock for probably all of us, with the pandemic changing the way we live our lives. But it also saw a big change in the world of sports. I think since 1990 or 2000, we felt like the top athletes or sports persons were self-indulgent. They only looked after themselves, they thought about their careers, and hardly bothered about what was happening in the society. And one fine day, all of that changed with the Black Lives Matters movement when George Floyd was killed in the US, and it spread like wildfire. But I think what we have missed over the years, this was a very organized and a worldwide movement which really took off. But there have been athlete activisms before, like there may be small steps. Baichung Bhutia saying he won't be part of the torch relay in 2008 because he didn't like the way the Chinese treated the Tibetans, or Soumya Swaminathan saying that I won't go and play the Asian team event in Iran because I don't want to be forced to wear a headscarf for a religious reason. There have been many people, like we all remember the 1968 black salute from the 1968 Olympics, but these are also small activisms. I think I'll start with Saurabh. And what really changed, Saurabh? Like activism to a large extent was an individual step that athletes took because they believed in it, especially when it came to racial abuse, also in European football and all that. So, what do you think? What changed in 2020 that we have started to see a organized movement of athletes when it comes to activism?
Thank you, Abhijeet, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion on a very interesting theme. And as Abhijeet pointed out, while there has been instances of activist interventions by sportsperson for pretty long history, at the same time, 2020 perhaps did mark a paradigmatic shift. But I would also like to emphasize on the fact that sports and politics has never really been separate. And as much as IOC or FIFA or other sporting bodies like to maintain the facade of neutrality of sport, when you look at the boycott of South Africa and pretty powerful mobilization that happened around that time, or even in cricket when Henry Olunga and Andy Flower wore that black band during the World Cup and paid a fairly heavy price in terms of their cricketing career. We do see examples of many of these, but a couple of incidents do stand out. One is the manner in which the systemic nature of racism in sports has really come to the light over the last few years, and also I think drew upon the larger shifts taking place in US politics, and perhaps without Donald Trump and perhaps the shock that election of Donald Trump and the systemic police violence that was highlighted in the aftermath of that, maybe we would not have seen the sort of churning that has also happened in the field of sports. But I would like to emphasize on a couple of legal questions that this whole activist engagement by sportsperson around Black Lives Matter has brought up. And also when you look at some of the debates that have happened in India, more so around where people have expected our celebrities to speak up and maybe they've remained silent, or the whole tweet war that happened in the aftermath of the tweet, famous or infamous, depending upon which side of the debate you are, of Rihanna's and a couple of other celebrities' tweets around the farm protest, and specifically when there were allegations against Wasim Zafar. And many of us expected that some of the senior cricketers would speak up in his support, and that hadn't happened. So what are the various legal questions that must be addressed? Few that I would like to touch upon just to map out some of the issues. One, of course, is the IOC Rule 50, which specifically says that any demonstration or racial or political propaganda would not be allowed. And when you look at the sort of gestures or the sort of mobilization that has happened, many would argue that perhaps some of them may fall foul of the Rule 50 prohibition. And IOC again reiterated in the guidelines of 2020 that many forms of protests and demonstrations would not be allowed at all. And while they made some concession with respect to non-sporting venues with social media and press conferences and meets others, as far as the sporting venue, when they reiterated that there cannot be any form of a political gesture at all. And first of all, what exactly are the boundaries of Rule 50 itself? Because as a lawyer, when you look at the words, Rule 50, and if I may read out from the specific clause, it speaks of how no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. Now, what exactly do we mean by propaganda? And would a legitimate voicing of opinion against the institutionalized nature of racism, where racism itself has been a serious problem in sports, so much so that football matches have had to be stopped? Can we really classify that as propaganda? And therefore, should we at all see them such activities as impermissible? So that's one of the issues that would have to be looked at, because IOC rule was speaking of propaganda. And perhaps from that angle, perhaps the restriction is not as sweeping as some commentators may believe. But at the same time, when you look at the 2020 rules, it speaks of all protests and demonstrations. And the guidelines also talk of specifically the illustration that they give is displaying any political messaging, including signs or armbands or gestures of a political nature. So is the guideline itself in conformity with the rule? I think that's a debate that sports lawyers have had to have, that what exactly are the boundaries of the prohibitions under Rule 50, and does it prohibit any form of political expression? And as much as the 2020 guideline seems to suggest that, is it really in conformity with what the text of Rule 50 suggests? The other thing that I'd like to highlight, and I'm sure all sports persons have understood this, in terms of their freedom of speech and expression, and where exactly do we draw the balance between the values of neutrality that IOC or FIFA or other sporting bodies proclaim to serve, and the basic human freedom of every other sports person, especially given that the IOC's own rules do talk of freedom of expression and speech for athletes. At a more general level, the Olympic Charter itself, Principles 4, speaks of practice of sport is a human right, and how every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination. If that is so, then as an African sports person who has been subject to discrimination on a pervasive basis, doesn't she or he have a right, or they have a right to voice their views against such form of institutionalized discrimination? And when IOC itself in its Olympic Charter recognizes sport as a human right, then perhaps we need to understand that there are certain elements of self-expression that have to be recognized. Similarly, its own Athletes' Rights Declaration makes references to freedom of expression. And at a broader level, as a Canadian Olympian and a sports lawyer has written, that IOC itself is an observer to the United Nations. And therefore, IOC must be bound by the general principles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And while one can understand that there has to be some limits that may be placed, can a complete sweeping blanket prohibition of the nature that we see in the Rule 50, can it at all be sustained? And that's another debate that we have to have. The third debate I'd like to emphasize on, and in the Indian context, especially in the context of cricket, might be much more relevant, is the contractual restrictions, where you have contracts that prohibit sportspersons from expressing their views on any political or social matter. Then can we see a serious repercussion being faced by sportspersons when there are opinions expressed, especially which run against the dominant view within the sporting body? And at a time in India where, despite the Lodha Committee's interventions and all the reforms, it seems as if the BCCI has been now directly under the control of the government in a way that it has never been in the past. any opinion that runs against the dominant ideology of the government, is there a serious chance of BCCI then coming down using the contractual clauses in there? And secondly, what would be the legality of any such repercussion? Being a non-state actor, maybe one might say that fundamental rights do not directly apply. But at the same time, in the Indian context, courts have recognized that sporting bodies are public bodies. And therefore, one might argue that some of the principles of fairness and non-arbitrariness must apply to sports persons and sporting bodies. So that's the other limit that we'll have to think of. And last thing before I stop and let the audience also reflect and think about what could be the other questions that may come up, is to what extent do we see this as a realistic form of a mobilization in an absence of sports bodies, organizations, in absence of collective bargaining or any form of larger organization among sports persons? When you said what has changed right at the beginning, I believe that the fact that you had athletes in US and UK play such a strong role was also shaped by the fact that they have, if not unions in a traditional manner, but players associations and other representative bodies supporting their voice. In an Indian context where historically organizations or attempts to organize sports persons haven't been very successful, do we really see a realistic chance of sports persons in India speaking up in a concerted manner? I would be very skeptical of that. And maybe the silence of Indian sports persons in comparison to some others across the world probably is explained by that. And our sports persons have been much more comfortable expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but have been completely silent on caste atrocities in this country and other forms of very violent atrocities that have come to light, and specifically police violence, if one has to draw a direct comparison with Black Lives Matter. We don't find our sports persons really speaking up on this. And I suspect that a lot of it is because of the vulnerability that they are facing, given the lack of a larger organized voice in India. So I think these are some of the issues that we'll have to think through in trying to work out what could be the legal responses to the larger questions of activism among sports persons, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh. A very detailed outlook on where we stand. But like you said, I think it looks like there is a change in perspective. Germany and Norway, a few days back when the World Championship qualifiers were happening, they wore the human rights T-shirts protesting against the way the migrant laborers are being treated in Qatar for the World Cup preparations. And FIFA actually came out with a statement saying that we would not take any action against the teams. Now, 2 or 3 years back, like the way Copernicus case happened, he took a stand and he had to pay the price because the entire organization stood against it. Nobody, even if we are speaking about the unions, nobody that time stood by him. Everybody kept quiet. He was forced to face the music. But this time, for the first time, you saw a FIFA executive coming out and saying that there will be no action taken, which probably is a bigger step in terms of how the organizations are looking at. Like to bring Mihir in. Mihir has covered a lot of football events. He has been to the Olympics. Mihir, do you think the way sports organizations look at sports and activism, do you think there has been a change over the years and now Black Lives Matters has actually forced them to take a stand?
I don't know. I really don't think so, actually. Uh, Even now, Abhijeet, I think there is this great imbalance between those governing the sports bodies and the athletes. And to a point that in most cases, people who run the sports believe that athletes are their properties, and they have to kind of behave the way they deem is right, which I guess is a big issue over here as well. I mean, we shouldn't forget that athletes are the number one stakeholders. So without them, there is no show. And you have politicians running the federations, you have businessmen running the federations, the same politicians, the same businessmen, uh, they use the athletes to endorse them as candidates in elections or endorse their products in whatever way they can. But when the same athletes tries to speak against a particular policy or speak on an issue, those same people, those very people say that, athletes should just stick to his job. It can't work both ways. If you want an athlete to promote XYZ product or XYZ minister or whatever, then you can't turn around and say that athletes should not speak up on issues. There is a huge contradiction over there. And I guess more so in India, where athletes are still very much dependent on the institutions, on the governments for all kinds of help. Uh, they are hence reluctant to speak up on issues, but we've seen it elsewhere too. I mean, I'd be very interested to see, if you mentioned the Norwegian and German players protesting last week at the World Cup qualifiers, but I'd be very interested to see if Erling Haaland, for example, he's joining Barcelona or any club that's owned by a Qatari or a UAE person, what will happen to his quote unquote moral standards over there. There is a gray area everywhere. You see athletes, of course, not all of them are, to use a Hindi phrase, "Doodh ka dhula." Federations certainly are not. Uh, and in between all this, we try to make sense of whatever is happening in terms of protests. Yes, the market changed this time. I think you asked Saurabh, but I also feel that the market change this time is that the athletes themselves are way more financially well off. I mean, if we look at what Muhammad Ali did during the Vietnam War, uh, he faced there was a lot of protests against him, against his actions back then, and he almost risked his career. The athletes this time around, they are insulated in that sense. They, like you mentioned, in some cases have received backing from their owners, the leagues, the fans. And again, when we speak of fans, we spoke a lot about the Black Lives Matters movement and how it has triggered this whole thing. But the Black Lives Matters movement also resonated a lot right now in the US because of the changing population. I mean, the whole identity over there. You have a lot more people from colored backgrounds now involved in sport. Uh, the athletes, you see a lot more diversity over there. The fans, of course, there is a lot more diversity over there. So you are not kind of singled out if you protest, and that I think is right now unique in the US. If we kind of copy paste that whole scenario in India, it won't work out. And I mean, Saurabh rightly said that we recently saw a video of police brutality in India, but our athletes, have they experienced any of it firsthand? I don't think so. And that's the difference, I guess, in the US. A lot of Black athletes, they have seen these discrimination firsthand, they've experienced it. And hence, when they talk about it, there is a lot more weight. I'm not saying that unless you experience it, you shouldn't speak about it. But the general awareness in Indian context of a lot of social issues is missing because our athletes are kind of cut away from reality right from the day they start entering the sports hostels and the sports schools. Uh, so yeah, I actually forgot about your question. I've kind of rambled, but yeah.
I was asking you, do you see any change in the way the federations are looking at stuff?
Not in India. If India is your point, not in India. I mean, we we've recently seen with all the tweets with the Rihanna issue. Uh, we see on and off athletes from Haryana who spoke about the farmers' protest because it directly affects them. A lot of them are from wrestlers, are from farming families, be it wrestlers, boxers. So they kind of relate with the issue a lot more. They spoke about it, and okay, it didn't really create much of a change, but at least they spoke about it. But you take any other incident, any social issue, any personal cause. I mean, the only time athletes in Haryana have spoken against the government policy very vehemently was when the Haryana government came up with the order that affected their prize money and the rewards they earn. So until it directly affected them, they haven't spoken on any issue. And like I said, Abhijeet, I think it's also right now we are in a stage right where it is unfair to expect our athletes to speak up on issues because their fate depends on the powers that be.
Very true. Like I probably would have brought this question later up, but because both of you have touched on this subject, in details. Basic question, like what you spoke about Black Lives Matters, it was a personal experience for a lot of players. When a lot of columnists or even fans in India start asking our celebrities or our athletes to start speaking of subjects like the farmers' protest or CAA, as for somewhere for me, activism has to come from within. You need to believe in the cause first. And do you, Saurabh, do you see that like the issues when we are speaking of political activism, to a large extent, Black Lives Matter is a political activism as well. It is just not a social activism. So when we are expecting our cricketers, our top athletes to take stands on political issues, how easy or how difficult it is when you don't know the issue, you do not really have a link. Like Mihir said, the farmer protest, yes, it resonated in Haryana, it resonated in Punjab because those guys have seen, they know the farmers movement. Somebody sitting in Mumbai who has never seen a farm, he may be a celebrity. Tomorrow, taking a stand for or against makes no sense. Neither you believe in it nor you have any experience of it. So how do we expect athletes to actually be activists when there is a political issue?
And that's a very interesting question because, as Mihir also pointed out, sports persons, by the very nature of their profession, are quite insular. Right from the very young age, being completely dedicated to their own sport means that often they might not have the exposure to quite a few social issues. And also in India, especially, apart from few sports, by and large, a lot of the social base of sports person is also from a relatively isolated, smaller pool, not exactly isolated, but either upper caste or urban milieu, and often they may not have the exposure to issues like farmers' rights, or haven't been victims of systematic discrimination of the sort that African American sports persons might have seen at a close quarters. So that certainly is true. But I'd also like to emphasize on a couple of points. One, the backlash, that potential backlash that you may face in India is perhaps astronomically much higher than any other country, given the sort of trolling that we see happening on social media. So maybe that makes our sports persons that much more risk averse. Secondly, if you look at your social media presence as a sort of a brand, then brand also reflects the consumer base in some ways. And despite the Trumpian campaign and the polarization that has happened in US in some ways, it also, you see a gradual consolidation of liberal constituency in US. And maybe that explains that from a brand position also, it's comparatively safer and maybe even more prudent for sports persons to take a more liberal position. And not just sports person, we are also seeing that with a lot of software companies and corporate giants. They have started taking explicitly liberal positions, at least on sexual minority rights and some of the other issues, which they perhaps might not have done. India, on the other hand, what we are seeing is a fairly strong consolidation of majoritarian sentiments, where any expression of support or solidarity for victims of state violence or victims of any form of prejudice results in a tremendous backlash. If you look at some of the sort of comments on the very anodyne statements by Harbhajan Singh or Irfan Pathan or some of the other footballers who did make few statements here and there, then you realize that probably the fact that in terms of a branding exercise, Indian sportspersons are reluctant to speak out on more liberal issues is also a reflection of the kind of country that we are seemingly becoming. And third point, which I again reiterate, that if your own position remains precarious, as a sports person, your profession necessarily is quite limited because you have only so many years of peak performance, and that makes you much more insecure than a lot of other workers. And secondly, you are in a state of, especially in India, in a relationship which mirrors some sort of a feudal patronage in the way in which Indian sporting bodies deal with sports persons. So that makes it that much more difficult. And you are right, where given your own lack of exposure, maybe you may not even have the understanding and wherewithal to understand the stakes involved. And often a half-hearted partial intervention can actually have consequences that you might, as a sports person, you might not have thought through. But I certainly believe that as icons of a society, as people who are celebrated and people whose opinions are looked up to, especially by youngsters, I think sportspersons do have a duty to take a position. And there may be times when you may not know all the intricacies of a particular debate, but there are certain universal values of freedom, universal values of human dignity, upon which I believe sportspersons also ought to take a stance. And I come back to the Wasim Zafar matter, because one may understand that you may not understand the technicalities of the Farm Bill or the technicalities of CAA, but where your own teammate, your former teammate might have been targeted, or where all sorts of filthy statements are made in social media against your own members of your own profession, then I believe there is a duty. And I'd like to draw the contrast between the way in which English cricketers responded to Taslima Nasreen's tweet against Moeen Ali and the utter silence of many of the Indian sportspersons. That, I think, does not really reflect very well on our sporting community. And as icons, as people who are supposed to be at the foreground of the community, I believe that sportspersons do have a role to play, at least in some of the most atrocious, egregious behavior, to speak out against that.
True. Like you said, it is also a way that culturally we are different. Like, I don't know, means there has been a Vineet who went and helped during pandemic. There have been social activism at the ground by a lot of players who have raised funds for social causes in their own local areas. Probably none of them are really taking political stands, but in terms of activism, in terms of helping people, there are a lot of sportspersons who go out of their way and do help. Like a Munaf Patel really has been helping the kids in his village and around in terms of their education, in terms of their overall development. That's also a sort of activism. But when you were talking, you spoke about social media as a branding exercise for athletes, which means they are also bound by certain contracts with their promoters, with their advertisers. Just to speak about that legal aspect of it, does that also hold, do you think that can that also hold a player back, because the advertiser or the promoter is more looking at his financials rather than an activist mode? Do you think that also affects an athlete to take a stand
Of
openly?
course, certainly. I think that is a major consideration for them, because there would be explicit contractual restrictions. But the issue that I think as lawyers and as legal system we might have to work out is if there are action taken, or if there are contractual clauses which specifically restrict your ability to speak up on certain themes, and an athlete does infringe those contractual terms, can he go and argue that such a contractual provision is actually not enforceable? Because in Indian law and most common law systems, we have provisions where we say that contracts which are opposed to public policy will be void. So is there a space for such an argument? And people who are lawyers in this audience, I think that's a point to reflect upon. While contractual restrictions are certainly a very major barrier for sportspersons, can we at all consider them as legal and see them as in consonance with public policy if the restrictions also prohibit you from speaking up on very fundamental issues relating to human dignity? Then I believe there might be some ground to at least explore that. While one may not have a clear-cut answer, at least see that as a question as to what extent those contractual clauses can be at all seen as enforceable.
Mihir, one part of this thing is like social activism or a social media activism as such. We have both been journalists. There is a certain kind of a mistrust also when it comes to celebrities. Like, yes, there are a lot of celebrities who have stood by PETA and all those. And a lot of times there is that mistrust whether this is a paid campaign or do they really believe in that activism. Now, as a sports person, because you interact with a lot of sports persons, what do you have you ever interacted with these guys? What do they think? How do they think that they will be perceived? Because I'm sure there are athletes who are traditionally right wing or who are liberals. Every individual is different, and even if they become stars, they will have their own personalities and their personal beliefs. And do you think that they really believe that they can come out and take a stand?
Of course, if they are free from all the pressures, the external pressures that they have, I think they'll surely do that. not all, but many of them. Abhijeet, just in the last few months, I've spoken to a lot of wrestlers because of the tournaments that were taking place in January and February on a whole range of issues, from the farmers' protest. I mean, even CAA came up, and I was very surprised that the awareness that they had on certain issues. Uh, when you speak to them off the record, one on one, they do have very solid opinions. uh, but when they take to the social media, and that's why you rightly mentioned the mistrust, because as a journalist, I always have a doubt who is writing. First of all, I don't, I, it, the, I mean, whether it is paid or not is a secondary question for me. I don't know, because there are so many tweets which I just wonder, how did this guy come up with this language? Forget everything else. So it begins, level of mistrust begins with that. So I don't take social media seriously, especially when it comes to athletes and their views on social media. But you talk to them one on one. There was very recently, I had spoken to one of the wrestlers on the whole CAA issue, and his views were, and this athlete till that moment I thought was extremely right wing, like more right wing than, say, the prime minister himself. But his views on CAA were refreshing, not just because it was different and it was anti-CAA. It's not my thing to judge him on his political ideologies, but he had an opinion, and I ended up asking, why don't you talk about it on your Instagram lives and your Twitter feeds and generally your public appearances? And he just, like Saurabh pointed out, he just says that, why should I get into this thing? Like, my job right now is to just focus on what I have to do, that is the Tokyo Olympics, and I just don't want to attract trolls. And in this age of social media, I think that is a very, very defining point. You don't want kind of people on your back all the time, and then pay for something that you truly believe.
Yeah, valid point. But why I asked you this question was very different. Like when we saw the Marcus Rashford event unfolding, the whole activism unfolding, it was really not a political movement for him. For him, it was about kids staying. Maybe there was a background of the parliament rejecting that bill, but it was still an activist speaking, a person who had suffered speaking about taking care of kids who cannot afford to eat. Now, there are issues, there are bigger issues in India. Leave the political issues which are there. There's still a lot of bigger issues in India. And we don't really see athletes even taking up those issues. Apart from, like you said, when they are losing out on money.
That is true. I mean, they don't even speak up on issues that affect them. I mean, we've hardly seen them talk about sexual abuse that is there in sport. We've seen our dozens and dozens of cricketers write autobiographies, but never has anyone gone in depth into the whole issue of match fixing in cricket. Uh, I mean, they don't talk about issues that affect their sport. So I'm not even expecting them to talk anything about political issues that are in the country right now. Uh, well, again, the Marcus Rashford thing, it's unique to the UK society. They have certain programs, certain plans over there, and hence it got the whole mileage and the attention. Uh, I mean, I would be surprised again if our guys took on the government uh, for, say, midday meal programs in school. Again, all this comes down to the whole power imbalance that is there in sport, be it them not talking about sexual abuse, match fixing, uh, basic soft government policies, or whatever. The power imbalance is such that eventually they'll be the ones who lose, unless you're above everything else.
But sort of coming back to this, like what Mihir is saying, is there, I don't know, means we are also speaking where we are speaking about sports laws, where we have we have been talking about laws, activism, but is there basically a need for education for athletes? Because probably we athletes are mostly insular to what is happening, unlike say a European football or NLB, where you have to struggle, then you come in, you have to like break the door to get into the system, and then you rise as a star. Whereas in India, even today, it's very delivered and very isolated. Like if you are good enough, you are taken into the system and you are actually isolated from the whole social system that is there outside. Is there a case for the overall education levels of the athletes to go up for them to take a stand?
Certainly so, but I would not necessarily see education from the point of view of taking a stance on political matters, but generally a wider worldview, because I'm sure every athlete would appreciate the fact that only a very select pool finally makes to the highest echelon. And there are so many others who are very talented but fall away for a variety of reasons. It could be injury, or maybe they were just not good enough to get into the final 30 or 40 top sports person of the country. And as a sort of a professional backup, having that education would ensure that you have other opportunities available to you. And even as a sports person, even for those who do succeed, having a larger educational support, and not just from a professional point of view, but also how to handle success, how to deal with the various psychological challenges that you have to deal with, especially given the sort of ups and downs that every sports person has to deal with, helps. And it's not a surprise that when you look at someone like, in the context of cricket, someone like Dravid being so measured and being an example for every one of us, and always emphasizing on the importance of education. And I believe that that educational background that he had helped him. And I certainly would believe that that applies to every single sports person, and especially more so for these sporting colleges and academies, where, as you said, people are taken in at a very young age. And then for them to exercise their capacities as a citizen, exercise their capacities as a member of a political community in a larger sense, probably requires that they have sufficient protection from the sufficient educational training and awareness. And also, as I said, from a professional point of view also. So I know that some changes are happening. I believe BCCI had done some sort of a curriculum for dealing with, especially at the early years of IPL, how youngsters who are now being given these contracts, them being given some sort of a training and mentorship. But I believe a lot more needs to be done. I'm sure Mihir would know much better what sort of programs are being carried out, if any at all, and how effective they are in practice. But surely there is a role for that.
Also, the legal, like when I was covering football, and it was not the ISL, it was the NFL, and there were a couple of players who actually came to me because they wanted to move from one team to the other. And when I spoke to them about the contract, they had actually signed a blank paper and never read what the contract was. To a large extent, when I played or whatever happened, for you taking a stand, the organization needed just one line saying indiscipline and you would not play again. So, from the legal side of it, do we think there is not enough protection for a player to take any stand in terms of internal activism? What Mihir was speaking about, the sexual abuse, the other issues of not being treated well. These are basic activism where I think if we can start, then the next level of political activism and the bigger activism starts. But in Indian sports, we are still not we are not having even that basic activism in sports. Do you think there is a need for more legal support for these
Yes,
players?
I think at one level, of course, is one about training and awareness, so that at least basic legal contractual matters, you have some understanding, you know whom to ask for support, and at least not to sign away your rights on a blank paper, so to speak. At least that much level of training and awareness needs to be done. But I come back to the larger point I've repeatedly been making on the need for organization. And I believe that any sort of sports regulation and regulatory framework that we have must have an institutionalized system of some form of a players association who can represent sports persons, both in negotiations with the association, but also in individual matters, whether there are complaints or when they want to file a woman athlete who wants to file a complaint, there's some sort of a support network. Players association can play a role in that. Unfortunately, in India, we haven't really made major headway on that front. But I believe that that is absolutely essential. At the end of the day, sports persons are also workers. And from that angle, their rights as workers have to be protected. And while certainly the rights of sports persons cannot be in the same manner as ordinary factory worker, but at least some form of players association, some form of an organized institutional space where there can be dialogue between the football association and the footballers players association, or between BCCI and players association, is all the more necessary. And even when you look at the Supreme Court's intervention in the whole BCCI matter and DODA committee's recommendations, they had specifically called for it, and there are models that we can draw from elsewhere in the world, and I believe that is necessary. Given the vulnerability that Indian sportsperson have, I don't see a traditional union being set up, a traditional association being set up. That's why it becomes all the more important that the government, or through the regulatory law that would be passed, if and when that would be passed, must have a clear-cut provision on players association as a mandatory requirement for all sporting associations, and with very defined platforms for dialogue.
What Saurabh said is true. Like, there has to be a platform for dialogue. But what do you think from a player's point of view? Because I remember when Deepika Pallikal took a stand of not playing the nationals because for want of equal prize money for men and women, even the other biggest player in Indian squash did not stand by her.
That
Then,
is an issue, right?
yeah, even the Football Players Association, they speak in 10 different voices, depending on which side who the player is. Then all individual sports haven't been able to form an association because you cannot come on the same common minimum program. So how do you think can Indian sports progress towards Saurabh wants a players union?
Uh, I think, Abhijit, the issue here is Indian sport, and when I say sport, I mean the thinking at a very basic administrative level to the way our players are evolving. Is that progressing at the same speed with which the rest of the world is progressing in terms of how sport is to be governed? I think we are still primitive in that sense. We want a lot of things to be implemented in India, which are kind of normal elsewhere in the world, but have we progressed that much? Now, if we look at the way sports are run in India, the way the governance model of sport, a lot of it is still stuck in the 90s and 80s. I mean, we haven't even really progressed that much. So, to hope that we have an athletes body, we have a commission for that looks after the welfare of the athletes. Of course, it will be nice if it happens, but we are still very far away from that being a reality. You mentioned football. Now, football, I think, is one of the few active players' body which claims to be independent. We can have another debate over that, but at least there has been an attempt there. They have been successful sometimes. Most of the times, they have not been successful. But then again, there are conflicting ideas and conflicting views over there, which eventually hampers the players. I mean, we have seen so many stories where despite the players association being there, the players are unpaid for a long time, and there are other issues as well, which I guess we don't need to go into right now. But even when there is a player's body, even when there is ex-player talking about an issue, there is no backing. I'm not talking about systematic backing, but even their own teammates, even their own peers do not back them. What we saw in the Black Lives Matters movement is, if except for Colin Kaepernick at the beginning, where he was isolated, since then, whoever started to take a stand, whoever took a knee, he was backed by his teammates, by his owner. Even the NBA CEO backed a team official for saying things against China, despite knowing the kind of backlash they would face. So at least they have that support, and that gives you confidence. I'm sure if you ask Deepika Pallikal, I doubt if she'll take a stand again if she knew that she won't be supported. So there are multiple factors. Athletes, for their own interest, they need to start speaking the same voice as well.
I think I had bigger hopes from the Olympic OAI, Olympic Association of India, where they brought all the Olympians on board. It looked like they could do something when the Olympic Association of India was formed. and it could become a platform because there was plans to bring athletes into more social causes and all that. It didn't work, but there's been a question on sports governance to Professor Bhattacharya by Parth Mehta. Uh, do you really think that for this whole aspect of athletes to go ahead and take stands or deal with the federations, is there a case of a mediator, a sports lawyers or sports agents taking more active role in the whole system for players to become feel more independent or more assured that they can take stands and there is some a support system to work with them?
Uh, Agent, I am little skeptical, and because their commercial interests may often be very closely enmeshed with that either of an individual player, and then can agents themselves have some sort of a larger legitimacy among all the stakeholders. But that's a model that can be thought of. But I certainly do agree that I think we need to also have some form of mediators. It could be sports lawyers, it could be perhaps other sort of stakeholders, including maybe former sports persons. But yes, it cannot only be sports persons. While they are the most important stakeholders, the fact also remains that not all of them have the expertise to sometimes navigate some of the complexities that may come up. And despite the whole rhetoric of sports administration being done by sports persons, the reality in India has been quite checkered. Not every retired sports person who has taken up administration has had a very remarkable stint, and some of them have been quite problematic to say the least. So possibly there is need for expertise. It could be sports lawyers, given that a lot of contractual matters could be understood well by sports lawyers. It could be a group of retired sports persons, sports lawyers, agents also. And also, I believe that at the end of the day, administrators do have a role to play, and not every administrator is a person out there to ruin the Indian sport. And so to understand, maybe we need to have adequate representation of all the different types of stakeholders who are there in the sporting field. And agents could be a worthwhile experiment, but I would like to see a more broad-based body. The bigger question is, how do we achieve that? Because the lawmakers themselves are enmeshed in administration in pretty much all the major sports, and the biggest resistance has come from those parliamentarians and the governmental actors. And when you look at the sports bill that had been drafted during the UPA era, within the UPA government itself, it had faced such a significant opposition, and almost every politician of any repute is there in one or the other major sporting body. They have a direct vested interest in not having any sort of a change. So how do we achieve and realize that? Maybe at some point the sports persons will have to get together, and what Football Players Association has done is a model. Despite it not being a perfect example, at least it's a start, and perhaps we might see similar associations elsewhere. The other, of course, is the courts intervention, as they did with BCCI. That also hasn't been particularly successful now when you look back at all that has happened in the last 6-7 years. But nonetheless, maybe given that we might need an external impetus, maybe courts are indeed that institution that can provide a impetus. But how independent are Indian courts at this moment from the government? I'm sure most lawyers will have different answers. So maybe judiciary itself is facing a legitimacy crisis of its own. So how much of impetus it can give to sports, I'm not entirely sure.
Yes, what you're saying is very true, but I'll go back slightly to the first discussion when you broad-based the points. While we are speaking about all these activism, and we are speaking about activism, probably this outside the field that can be taken up. But the bigger issue, the Article 50 of the IOC Charter and the whole contractual obligations of playing, and because now Tokyo Olympics is still on technically, we don't know whether it will happen. But again, that Article 50 will come into play when the Olympics or major events start. And that is where the bigger challenge is going to be. Like you said, you want to have that freedom of speech, but how much is a big question. And how do you balance that? Because that is the major thing. Like we may say that IOC is wrong in not allowing anybody to express, or there could be a problem where an Israeli and an Iranian athlete both decide to protest at the same venue, at the same place, and then you have a different political issue to deal with. Now, how do federations or international federations actually deal with this? Is there a middle path?
That's a challenge. In fact, the new sort of guidelines that the Athletes Commission is supposed to be working on, and IOC has suggested that will come into place, supposed to come into place actually by the first quarter of 2021, probably is deliberating on it, and we'll have to see what sort of balance it seeks to achieve. But my suggestion would be to perhaps read down the prohibition under article or the rule 50 to emphasize on the fact that maybe demonstrations are prohibited, and then specifically gestures which vilify any particular community, vilify any particular race, be prohibited, and maybe hate speech or some of the most egregious forms of expression be limited, but a symbol that speaks in solidarity for a larger problem of racism, or taking a stance against gender-based violence, probably we have to allow them. A controversial issue between two countries, maybe one can draw a line and say that these might vitiate the entire spirit of collegiality that sports is played in, and therefore maybe we can place a restriction. But very basic universal values like racism, gender violence, or in protection of human rights for all, those sort of gestures ought not to be limited at all. And when you look at international human rights law, the doctrine of proportionality does provide us a standard that restrictions have to be reasonable, restrictions have to be proportionate. And from that angle, maybe boundaries have to be drawn. And boundaries have to be possibly drawn around specific political disputes, specific disputed propaganda. And when you go back to the text of the rule, it speaks of propaganda and demonstration. One can understand why a demonstration in the middle of a sporting arena might be problematic. But to wear an armband, to have a Black Power salute, I don't see why those forms of expression ought to be restricted. And I believe that a very narrow reading of the rule may allow us a way out to ensure that some of the most controversial parts of expression are limited, but at the same time, it does not prohibit sports persons from expressing views on matters that I believe sporting body itself has a role to weed out, whether it's racism, whether it's any form of hate speech, whether it's any form of gender-based exploitation, and the rights of sexual minorities and others. The sporting bodies themselves have a mandate to take a stance against that, and limited forms of expressions and gestures, which does not affect the integrity of the sporting event by itself, should be allowed. But at the same time, I'm sure many other lawyers may have a different position on that.
Mihir, as a journalist, what do you think? Like in 2017, when Bilkis Abdul Qadir fought for the hijab ban against FIBA because she said that it is her right to wear it and she should be allowed to wear it. On the same time, Soumya and the other chess players had an objection on going to Iran, and there was a big backlash because others felt that by not going to Iran, the girls not going to Iran and not playing is actually going to hurt the girls in Iran who wanted to take up sport. Now, as a journalist, what do you think? How is there a way to balance this?
No, I don't think so. Eventually, it all comes down to what an individual believes. I mean, if Soumya, for example, has taken a stand and not go to Iran, then we can't be hypocrites and say that, look, you are doing what you're doing is wrong. On one hand, if we expect our athletes to take a particular stand, then whether right or wrong, we can't turn around and say, okay, look, what you're saying is not right. I mean, they take a stand, you kind of agree, disagree, that's a different story. So I don't think there is any way there. What I think is an issue over here is there is a larger political play going on everywhere. You mentioned about Iran and Israel. We saw in the Rio Olympics where Lebanese athletes, they did not kind of allow Israeli athletes to get on their bus while going to the opening ceremony. Protests will take place, and they'll take place in different ways. I remember, I think in 2004 Olympics, if I'm not wrong, it was an Irani or Israeli judo player who was supposed to take on the opposing country. I don't remember whether it was Iran or Israel, but instead of kind of opposing the whole thing directly, whether directly saying that I won't play that guy, he just overrate the earlier day, and he got disqualified at the weigh-in. So I'm sure athletes will find innovative ways to do those things because they are under pressure from their own governments. But Abhijeet, and I think Saurabh or any of the others who perhaps would be aware, I'm also very interested to know about the Rule 50. Now, if an athlete protests at the stadium, for example, at the podium or on the field of play, would the IOC actually have any legal standing to punish him? Because technically, it is his work of play. It is his place of work. So, I mean, can the athlete not express himself over there? That I think is one question, and that is one of the many contradictions over here. Because even in the athletes commission, for example, the athletes commission have to sign to the they're required to sign an Olympic oath. The Olympic oath is based on the Olympic Charter. So, if, for example, you're on the athletes commission, you kind of have to agree with whatever the IOC says, or else you're going technically against the Olympic Charter. I know I'm kind of deviating from your question, Abhijeet, but eventually it all comes down to that, because each and every sport signs up to the Olympic Charter. So if Soumya is not going to Iran for the hijab issue, it eventually comes down to whether it is in spirit of the game, whether it is in fairness or Olympic Charter. So all these issues are interlinked. I don't think there is one correct answer to it. Lots of gray areas, but lots of contradictions, I guess.
Saurabh, you want to address that question which he asked about the legalities if I decide to protest?
Right. Like all the questions, my answer again would be that there's no easy answer at all. Technically, they claim that they have the power. And in fact, the latest guidelines that they reiterated in 2020, they said that while they are not indicating the penalty, a case-by-case decision would be taken. On the other hand, I also believe that there is ample ground to argue that, as Mihir already pointed out, that IOC must respect the rights of the athletes as workers in their workplace. And to that extent, perhaps, they would be bound by principles of European Convention of Human Rights, at least in the context of European athletes. And there are some lawyers who have made the argument that looking at the case laws of the European Court of Human Rights, there is a possibility that perhaps if IOC does take an action, then maybe there may be a legitimate space for an athlete to go and challenge that before the European Court of Human Rights. The more direct argument has been that to look at the Swiss law and argue that any provision where a complete restriction is placed on freedom of speech and expression would be against public policy, and therefore any decision of IOC would be then subject to legal challenge. And even if we don't go by the European human rights law, perhaps there is sufficient space within the Court of Arbitration for Sports and then within Swiss law to go and challenge some of these. There isn't any clear-cut answer that I can say for sure, but these are pathways that will have to be explored. And I believe that only where these pathways are explored and mandate is imposed upon IOC, probably a legal duty would be cast upon IOC to at least have some form of a reasonable stance, a balance of rights of the freedom of speech and expression of the athletes, and on the other hand, the need to maintain neutrality of sporting space. So I do believe that there is a possible ground available to challenge them, but they haven't been fully explored at this juncture. So one, of course, and my sense is that if there is indeed such a case, I suspect that beyond a slap on the wrist, probably IOC is not going to take any serious step, because I go back to the earlier argument I'd made about brand value. And given the larger liberal activism, at least in the social media world, I believe that any action that the IOC takes is going to face some sort of a backlash. And when you look at the US Olympic and Paralympics committee saying that we are not going to take action, and some of the other sporting bodies also saying that they're going to be flexible. That is itself a reflection of the fact that Rule 50 cannot be implemented in a stringent manner. And while IOC may have reiterated the prohibition, if an actual case comes, I'd be surprised if very serious bans are imposed in 2022. But if they are indeed imposed, probably legal space does exist for challenging those decisions.
Sorry, the cynical journalist in me gets reminded of that third white man in that power salute, Peter Norman, who stood there and never got to play again, Olympics ever again. And no legal action needed to be taken. He was just sidelined by the federation and never got to play again. And there have been a lot of stories as journalists we know where you have taken a slightest stand. Nobody ever took action against your stand, but you just went into wilderness. And like you said, you have a very small window of a career. And if not, do you think that is why the bigger question, which a lot of Indian athletes do ask us, do you think the sports bill or any real change in sports governance law could help athletes?
Is that a question to me?
To both, like from a journalist point of view, Mihir can answer. From a more of a academic point of view, the legal point of view, you can answer.
Again, no, Abhijeet, the cynical journalist in me would say no, there won't be any change, I guess, because I mean there are so many laws and so many rules. I mean, again, I'm preaching to the choir here, because all of you guys over here are legal experts. You know what laws exist on paper, what have been implemented, and how much effort those laws have made, not because of the lack of intent, but just because the people who control our sports, and I deliberately use the word control because they do that. The people who control our sport are just way too powerful. I mean, if you go to a wrestling match, the wrestler who wins the bout, before going and meeting his coach or his parent, he goes and seeks the blessings of the president of the wrestling federation. That's the kind of power these guys wield. So if there is a law, by law, that guy, I would question how he became the president of the federation, first of all, and then I would go and maybe ask if it would protect the athlete. So whether it's the sports bill or any other bill, I don't think the power balance over here would change, and by extension, I don't think the athletes would be empowered that much.
Not as a completely cynical and jaded lawyer, and despite all the reasons to the contrary, still having some reason for optimism, I do believe that incremental changes are possible. To expect that with the legislation, the entire sporting ecosystem would be transformed, would be to live in a fool's paradise. But at the same time, despite all the difficulties that we are seeing with the Lodha committee decision, some changes have happened, some minor incremental changes have happened. And I suspect if a sports bill does come into, depending upon the content of that bill, incremental changes may happen. At the larger level, all legal norms operate within a social milieu. And the Indian sporting system is a highly feudal system, in my opinion, and where the administrators are largely in a position of Maibap with respect to sportspersons, and even very senior, powerful, rich sportspersons also behave in that manner, and for very good reasons in the way our sporting system is structured. So I suspect that any law will also have to be mediated by that sort of a power relation. So I don't see any radical transformation happening. But at the same time, just having an association at least will give some sportsperson a voice to speak up. Having term limits on administrators might see greater turnover between administrators, and you will not have personal fiefdoms being carried on in the way it has been so far, at least in the long run. So I hope that incrementally some changes are going to take place. But whether it's India or elsewhere, we have to recognize that sportspersons are in an acutely vulnerable position, given that you only have one employer potentially for many sports, and given your short career, and for individual sports, given how extremely competitive and individualized it is, it becomes that much more difficult to really be able to negotiate and exercise your rights. So given that vulnerability is going to always remain, the challenge is how do we mitigate some of that vulnerability through support systems in the legal regime. Whether that's going to happen is a different debate altogether, but I believe if that does take place, incrementally some changes might.
Yeah, like you said, though you are not as cynical as me, probably you all still painted a gloom picture when it comes to the legal aspect of it. Nah, like to end this, like I would like to ask both of you, when we are speaking of athlete activism in sports, we are more about actually the activism outside sports. There is a lot of activism in sports, like me spoke about the sexual abuse, the whole gender gap issue. To begin with, the world over, the European, let's not compare the Europeans and the US athletes to an extent. But to begin with, what changes in terms of athletes' approach would you like in the Indian context? How do you like when you are saying the incremental development of the athlete activism? What do you think should be the path that we should take?
One would be what we already spoke of, the greater amount of perhaps training and education, so that they are aware about their legal rights, they're aware of what sort of avenues are available to them. Second, I certainly would like to see greater activism in within the sports by retired sports persons, because comparatively they have less to lose. And while I did say that not every retired sports person becomes a great administrator, but at the same time, if retired sports person do play a more active role as an organization, they can indeed put some pressure on various administrators. Again, one cannot expect any dramatic change, but I do see, compared to current sports persons, who would much rather focus on the next upcoming tournament rather than meet lawyers or meet bureaucrats or politicians. Retired sportspersons may be able to work as a organized lobby. And while one should not at all compare defense persons with sports persons at all, but you see in another field where the acting serving personals are, relatively speaking, even now in India, completely insulated from politics. And yet we saw that the ex-servicemen's associations have played a very active role in foregrounding some of the concerns about servicemen in the public discourse. So I suspect that some parallels lessons will have to be learned. The other, as I said, even if not through a law, maybe more sporting bodies have to start thinking in terms of some form of sports associations. They may be imperfect, they may be powerless in the initial years, and there may be divisions within them. But if you can have some form of a space that at least once a year you meet and hear what their concerns are, bring about internal complaints committee following the Vishaka guidelines and the 2013 Sexual Harassment Act, that every sporting body must have a complaint committee before whom a sports person or a aggrieved woman can go and file a complaint. Those steps must be taken, and some of these are doable.
I think the most important change would be if athletes don't take a sport for a government job. If that dependency goes away, then you probably will get more liberty to not just speak on issue. That's not my concern. I mean, uh, just to be more free in terms of how you play the sport, how you talk to others. That whole power equation will change. I was listening to a nice podcast yesterday where Aaron Sorkin, the director, producer, scriptwriter, he was saying that in his very early days, he realized one thing, that if you go to a network and you show that you're desperate for that pilot to be accepted, that moment onwards, the network owns you. In India, that's what happens. The moment an athlete enters a sports hostel, uh, and that desperation is evident because they come from backgrounds which are not really well off, most of them anyway. uh, the powers that we start owning them. So unless that change, unless our athletes stop looking at sport as a job, uh, I don't see things changing. We can talk about having bodies, player association, independent bodies, everything else. But unless that changes, where athletes are more free to express themselves, not just off the field, but on the field, things won't change. And that can only happen if they don't depend on government for any dole.
A very, very, very different point from everyone, where we are speaking about activism, where you bring in a point of where you start. Because if you are not independent to start with, I don't think you can be independent to take a stand. I think very interesting discussion today, and more importantly, I think we try to understand athlete activism just off, not just on the field, but off the field. But yes, there's a long way to go, and I'm not really sure whether political activism will start. But I just hope that our athletes start becoming activists for their own rights and for those people who are part of their support system. And I guess that would be a big step forward for Indian sports.